good old English tea. How's it going, my G? Slurpty derp. Hope you're all doing super sick. And today I'm going to do a special video about hi-hats. And so in my years of teaching, there's been a lot of things that I've repeated over and over again. And what I've done is I've thought of 7 of the most useful tips that you can use when it comes to mixing down your hi-hats, getting a nice flavour to your drums. And yeah, we're going to be focusing mostly on using like audio hi-hats, so you can make some great sort of hi-hat loops using like drum synths and like addictive drums and things like that. But I've always done it through audio, and so this is mostly going to be about using samples and things like that. And yeah, the thing for me is sometimes I think people underappreciate or undervalue choosing the right hats. And for me, it's kind of like choosing your wife or like your spouse or your life partner. Like, it's that important if you're going to go for hi-hat 19 or hi-hat 21. Like, it's really going to either add to your life, or it's going to just be like, okay, that was like a bit like pointless. Anyway, let's jump straight into the video and tip number 1. So tip number 1, never ever repeat the same singular hi-hat sample over and over and over again. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean here. So this is kind of a little bit more like a beginner sort of trait, but often what people will do is they'll just grab one singular hi-hat sound and then just loop it over and over again like this. And instantly, it's very robotic. It's the same sample. Your ears will detect that it's the same sound over and over again. Thus, it will get very, very tiring and boring very, very quickly. Now, there's effects and things you can do to like make the sound a bit different every time, like a bit of chorus or ensemble or some tape saturation or tape delay. There's a lot of things you could do, but it's kind of a bit pointless in the end, because you can basically, with the amount of hi-hats that exist out there, you can create a much better loop which doesn't involve using the same hi-hat over and over again. So I would just suggest to avoid it altogether. So what I've got is I've got like a drum break here with just a kick and a snare with a few like layers on my snare. And if we add in these sort of robotic hats now, like these kind of, one shots. Very, very bland, very boring, and I would just suggest completely not doing that ever again at all. So let's move on to tip number 2. So tip number 2 for your hats, do you like what I've done there? Is never be afraid to use a good hi-hat loop to get a nice groove into your drums. So the thing is, often, and we will go into this, building our own hat grooves with individual sounds. But if you're starting out, it can be really, really useful to just use a nice hat loop to get that groove. And a lot of my songs I've just used like the perfect hat loop, and there's so many available. So I would suggest finding a bunch and then going through them and just paying attention to the swing and the groove that the hats will create, because it's that realism that's going to give life to your drums, which was lacking in the Robo hat. So let's have a quick look at what a good hat loop would look like. So here I've picked out a hat loop from my Neurofunk Toolbox sample pack, and that's available on my website in case you want it, but there's loads of great hat loops out there anyway. And this is called the Flat Hats, and it's very, very simple. But what you'll notice is it's very sort of a flat, like normal kind of hi-hat sound. It doesn't have like a special character on it. But what you'll notice is that you can even see in the file that each of the little hi-hat kind of pieces of audio are slightly different. So there's probably 2 or 3 different sort of hi-hats that I've made, and I've probably made this loop myself. But it's just a really simple way that you can, just straight away throw in a loop. But the idea is that these loops, they have that element of realism in them already. So although it's quite subtle, it's every little hit is very, very slightly different, and that creates a sense of realism. And I could probably pick out another hi-hat loop that has like more crazy stuff going on. But even if you just play this simple hi-hat loop with our drums now, it has a bit more of a chugging rhythm. It has a bit more of like, just an element of funk to it as well. like it's much better than the previous Robo Hat kind of thing that we did here. Yeah. So don't have to use my hi-hat loops, but find a bunch of different hi-hat loops and pay attention to the kind of swing and most importantly the changes in the timbre on each hat hit, and use something like that if you're just starting out with the rest of your hopefully your one-shot kick and snares, because you want to control those separately. But yeah, don't be afraid to use hi-hat loops to get a good sense of feeling for groove, like when you're starting out. So tip number 3 then is pay attention to the harsh frequencies in hats, particularly in the high end, because every sample that you select, the hats are mostly a kind of high end element to your track, and therefore a lot of the sounds that you will use, they may have some really high frequency spikes that are a bit harsh in there. And I also advocate against sort of distorting or saturating hats, because they already have so much high end, and sometimes it can be a little bit harsh in areas that the more you distort them, the more it just starts to hurt your ears. So yeah, let's have a little look on an EQ at some sort of examples of like a harsh frequency in a hat. So if we go back to our sort of robo hats here, the first sound, although it's not terrible with the frequency content, it does have a little bit too much sort of going on in the high end here. And you can see around here, this is about 5k up until almost 14k or so. We got quite a nice spiking up of sort of these EQ points here. Using span, you get the most realist, the most accurate kind of representation. But these guys kind of spike up quite a lot. So if I really wanted to use these hats, I'd probably do a little bit of EQing. And again, you can see it here on the channel EQ. I'd probably take a bit of that out, particularly these high peaks here. And sort of flatten that out a little bit, And then obviously to compensate the volume, you can just turn the actual output up a little bit. And it's a little bit more of a flatter response, because you want things nice and flat in the high end, because that's going to equal smoothness. So always check for harsh frequencies, because you should be able to pick them up in your ears. You should be able to hear that it's a bit harsh. But just in case you don't, just check for these like frequency spikes. And usually if you've got something in there that's sort of really like bad in a sense, like too much of a high frequency kind of spike, it's just the wrong sample. So just pick another one, because there's about 7 billion. So just a quick little interlude. If you enjoy this type of content, you can always support me on Discord via Patreon. You can subscribe there and join my community. And also, I've been teaching music production for the last few years, and I've taught over 70 people. Some of them have actually gone on to get signed to Hospital and also to RAM. But I teach all ranges, so bringing beginners up to that intermediate level, getting those intermediate guys up to that advanced level, and even occasionally catching up with the advanced guys and just like seeing what else we can do to improve. So always feel free to book yourself in for a one-on-one session. I have an online calendar, so you don't even really need to ask me. If you really think that I can help you out, you can just book yourself in, whatever's available, and I'd be absolutely happy to help you. But let's continue with tip number 4. So tip number 4 is people sometimes will cut out too much low end of the hats as well, and this will cut out the character. So what's really important to know in a hi-hat is, although it's a sort of mainly a high frequency sound, it does have a little bit of mid-range in there, and it's that mid-range that actually gives it, it's the fundamental of the hat, and it's what gives it its character. And if you start to take too much of that out, you'll essentially end up with a really tinny, like underwhelming hi-hat sound that kind of loses that sort of fundamental like push and groove that kind of drives the drums. So yeah, EQing it out too much can be a bit of a problem, but also leaving too much low end rumble in is also going to affect the rest of your mix. So it's always a balancing point, a sweet spot. Let's have a little look. So here I've got some sort of faster hats that I've programmed in, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But these are, they have a lot of low end in as well, as you can see here. on the EQ. So if I just begin to EQ them, and I'll show you the sort of frequency areas that I would always focus on. Obviously, smoother EQ cuts are always better. But what a lot of people will do if they're starting out, they'll think that they got to really, really take it up to 2K or something. You know, and at that point, you've really lost all of the character of the hats, you know, that realistic sort of feeling on them. So if I go back down to about 1K, here I have a bit more of that character in, but I have, you do sort of hear that it's missing, you know. Here it sort of starts to come back again. There, I've got a little bit of rumble I can hear, which I don't really like. Around there, I've got the sort of perfect balance where the hi-hat sort of feels like I've taken out the rumble from the recording that wasn't supposed to be there, but I can still hear that main like sort of character on the hat that's sort of driving the rhythm, sort of around 600k or 600 or 800 hertz. So here is the issue that comes in. You know, this would be a perfect point to EQ the hat. But if I've got a lot of other things going on in my track, a lot of basses and leads and things, this area here is going to start to conflict with all of my other elements, like the mid basses and things like that. So I've got to be extra careful here with how much I want to sacrifice, you know, the mix down on my track, or how much I want to sacrifice the hi-hat. So although this would be a perfect sort of spot, I would probably, you know, I would start with this EQ point, and then I would listen in the mix with all my other things and see if I need to take out some more. So maybe I'll add another EQ like this. Just to take out a little bit more. And then around there, you know, I've left in, you know, the most part of that sort of character, but I've been quite clinical with taking out as much as I possibly can. So it's always a nice balance. But yeah, just definitely don't, you know, take things all the way up here on these sort of hats that really have a nice sort of fundamental kind of punch to them. So yeah, make sure you don't like over EQ the hats. It's always smoother, and pay attention with how they relate to the particular mix down of your song. Let's get into tip number 5. So tip number 5 is you should more often than not be using a transient shaper to control your hi-hats and to soften them. So you rarely need to turn up the attack or the sustain. It's usually a case of turning them both down, but turning down the attack will soften the transient on the hi-hat. And the reason that I do this is because 90% of hi-hat samples that you get, they have a really, really loud transient on them already. And the problem is when you're playing them over the top of a kick and a snare, the kick and the snare have a transient, and that should really take priority, like especially in electronic music. So you want to get that punchiness from the kick and the punchiness of the snare to always shine through the mix down uninterrupted, and a transient on a hi-hat is really going to mess that up. So it's a case of always getting that softness of the hi-hat just perfect. And if you get that right with the transient shaper, you don't really so much need to sidechain things, because the hi-hat will just naturally be soft enough that it just blends with the kick and snare perfectly. So let's have a little example check thing here. Let's go. So if I use these sort of loud fast hats as an example with my sort of drums here, you know, without them, you really hear like the kick and snare like really punchy. But when I add them in, you know, they're very loud, obviously, but they do take away the punch from the kick and the snare because the transients are conflicting. So the best way to remedy that, and I love the Kilohertz transient shaper because I feel like it sounds and does the job the best, and I think it's really easy to use. And all I don't really even play with the speed much. It's just literally taking down the attack. And yeah, always, pretty 90% of the time I'm using it, I'm softening things rather than, you know, boosting things up, because it's better to sort of take away transients from things to let the mix down, you know, naturally become dynamic, rather than to try and like artificially introduce more transients to sounds that you probably picked wrongly in the first place. So attack down on the hat to get the kick and snare to really cut through a bit more. So here about 24% or so. You know, you hear the big difference when I put it back on. I'm listening to the kick and snare, and I can hear the transient on them being a lot cleaner and coming through the mix down when I've taken the attack down on the hats. So more often than not, you should be doing this on a lot of your hat samples, because a lot of them are really sharp and have a lot of transients on. So it's usually the case that I will do this like 90% of the time. Yes, let's move on to the next tip. So much in a similar way to how I'm softening the transients on the hats. Again, to go one step further and really allow, you know, the kicks and snares to take the priority in the punch of the drums, especially if I have a lot of hi-hat cymbals in one sort of group, is I would love to do a bit of compression on the cymbal group. And what this will do is it'll catch those really, really loud peaks that happens, you know, in a lot of the hi-hats, especially when you sort of, layering them on top of each other. It'll catch those loud parts and just balance them down a bit and bring the hi-hats to a more sort of controllable volume, like kind of shape. Like it'll flatten out the sort of, you know, the peaks. And when you do that and compress it that way, you know, you'll slot it, you know, sort of slightly lower in the mix down in volume, and you'll give that extra emphasis and clarity to the kick and snare that they deserve. So let's have a quick little look at how we could compress the group quickly. So let's say I've got a couple of hi-hat kind of loops. I've got this kind of loop here and these one shots. Maybe I add in a few of these extra layers, some tambourines and some kind of extra little hi-hat taps. So we got a few things going on in the cymbals here. So what we'll do next is we'll just add a little bit of compression, and really for this job, like any compressor will work. So here I'll even use, what can I use? Maybe I'll just use like the standard Logic one, but any simple compressor will do the job. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to just sort of turn the attack down, and I'm going to look at the threshold, and I just want to catch the sort of peaks here a little bit. I don't want to turn the make up, so no like auto gain or things being turned up. We're turning things down overall, and we're just catching those loud peaks. And now we've done that, if we play that with our kick and snare again now. It's taking those loud parts, bringing them down a little bit, and then it's, you know, compressing the hi-hat group and then slotting it slightly further back in the mix, so it's a little bit quieter. And yeah, we have a bit of a smoother hi-hat group that doesn't, again, it's that next stage of, you know, really just making sure that our kick and snare transients can shine through amongst all of the hi-hats. So pretty happy with there. I turned the threshold a little bit more to get a bit more compression there, and that's how I would sort of, you know, group my cymbals and compress them to make sure that they you know, duck a little bit out of the way of the kick and snare, which is going to make the whole drum group more 3D and more dynamic, and you're going to have a more impactful kick and snare, which is what you really want. So let's get into our final tip. So my final tip then is a little bit more of an advanced one, and it's about using individual hi-hat one-shots to create like your own loop, which is something that will get you that extra control, and like it's a little bit more advanced, but because you can essentially, what you can do is you can time each specific hi-hat kind of, you know, hit, like, because they have a little different sound on them. You can put them in the right spots of your track that will complement the rest of the sounds that are going on. So you can get quite in detail here and really get like that perfect kind of groove to fit with the rest of your track. So that's actually the goal to aim for in the end, is to really program in your own like individual hat sounds. And of course it might be easier to do this in like certain plugins like Addictive Drums or things like that. I personally never use them, but the idea in those sort of plugins is they have, you know, a hi-hat, but each time you hit it, it's a slightly different recording, it's a slightly different sound, which makes it natural. And in the same way, if you have just a big folder of hi-hats, you can just use the individual separate sounds and like use those audio files, you know, throughout the course of the loop to create that like realistic groove. So I'm going to show you like a little one that I made earlier, and yeah, show you how and why it's important to have these differences in the hi-hats and to really like train your ear to like notice the little details in each hat and how and where you can place them to create like a realistic hat groove yourself that will also fit with your track. So let's have a little look. So ideally, if you're not using a sort of drum synth or something like that, you want to be building up your own sort of collection of hi-hats and things like that. So I've got many drum hits and samples, and you know, I've got some sort of folders which have lots and lots of hi-hats in. So if I take a look here, for example, if I play these, you know, I've got a bunch of different hi-hat recordings. And for example, these 4 here, or 5, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, they're all like very similar, but they're a different recording each time. And these 5, for example, would be a perfect 5 to pick to then layer up like a new hi-hat loop, because it's a very similar kind of, it's the same hi-hat, it's just a different recording each time. So that's going to make it sound like slightly different, but it's still like the same hi-hat. It's not like I'm picking like 5 random hi-hats from different sample packs. So you want something like a nice big folder of like, you know, recorded drums. So that's like the most helpful thing that you could have really in your sample folder for this kind of job. And so yeah, this loop that I made here earlier, this kind of fast one I sort of showed you before, we're going to have a little listen to it, and then I'm going to sort of process it to fit with the drums a little bit better. So I've taken sort of 3 or 4 hi-hats out of my folder, and you can hear it's slightly different. It's like dun 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 dun, like they all have a little bit of a different pitch on them almost. You know, I've programmed that in myself, and if I play it with the kick and snare here, you know, what we can do is we can just mix it a little bit together now to get it to fit. So I've already sort of taken out a bit of the low end on the EQ here. And I've done a bit of transient shaping to take down the attack, so the transients of the kick and snare really cut through. But what I want to do next is I'm just going to add another shaper just for fun. I think that they're quite sort of long. These hi-hats are pretty open, you know, so I want to actually take down the sustain to make them a bit tighter. That's a bit nicer. I like that around there. And then a couple more things I could do to like gel them into the mix even more. I'll show you one example would be, you know, like an ensemble, which is again something you should use very subtly. Either ensemble or like a tape saturation that adds like a sort of automatic sort of pitch bending into the sound. And so here, if I use the ensemble from Kilohertz, let's put the random on and detune it. Turn the voices right up. Maybe spread it a little bit. You've got that crazy pitch detuning going on. And if I just mix that back now, just a small amount. Okay, what that does is it blends it into the mix even more, because, you know, the 2 main things that you can use to blend like a new sound, say it's a recording from a random sample pack, into what you've already got, like chorus and reverb are like 2 of the main things you can use to like sort of wash the sound out so it kind of fits in a bit better. So yeah, the ensemble, very small amount, and then let's do a bit of reverb as well, like a really small amount. And I'm going to use the chroma verb because I can just add in a bit of the wet signal here without taking out the dry. If I just turn the decay down, And we're just placing it into a room, so it's going to be a little bit long, but it's going to be really quiet. There we go. Just play that. You can hear that tiny little tail, so it's in a room, but it's, you know, it's very, very unnoticeable on its own. But, you know, when you add it all together, it's going to just help it fit in with the rest of the drums more. So the next thing I would do is let's just turn them down a bit as well, because they're quite fast and aggressive. And if we just get that volume level perfect as well, it's going to just finish everything off, you know, nicely. But what's important is we've done it sort of at a high volume, so we can hear the effects of what we're doing. And then once we've done that, we can turn it down. You know, putting them a little bit more in the background, and thus making the whole drum group a bit more 3D. Yeah, so if I add a few of my other sort of sounds back in here, for example, all these other guys. Maybe even this hat loop here. That's a little bit too loud or aggressive, that one. Probably needs a bit of transient shaping there on this guy, but we'll leave him off for a moment. But we've got quite a nice, like, kind of hat sort of symbol group overall now, with everything added together here. So there's a nice, like, balanced layer of hats. But yeah, the important thing that I really wanted to go over was just those 7 tips. And yeah, you can rewatch it if you have to, if you've kind of forgotten them all now, which I have. But yeah, all of those 7 tips I highly recommend all of those, and they're the things that I go over the most with students when we're like perfecting the mix down. It's usually a lot of those tips are things that we have to do to the hats to get like the whole drum group to like really sing. Yes, but anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this video today, and yeah, much love, peace out, don't do anything I wouldn't, ciao for now, ciao bella, arigato gozaimasu, arrivederci, bye.